Well, the politics of development and evaluation I find quite interesting because at some level development is really being transformed, but at another level it's really not changing much at all. I think one of the things that's happening, and this has been happening for a while now, it didn't start this year, is the privatization of development. I think that's been going on for over a decade now. And I think that public sector development is going down while private sector development is going up. And I think that changes what we do. I think a second thing that's going on is the Sustainable Development Goals. And as we all know very well, that we've transitioned from the Millennial Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals. I have mixed feelings about it because at one level I think it's, when you read the Sustainable Development Goals, it's beautiful, you know, end poverty. It's hard to be against that. People should have water, people should be happy. These are all wonderful things. But they seem kind of unrealistic in terms of what's actually happening on the ground. So there's this disconnect between the Sustainable Development Goals and what's actually happening to people on the ground. That makes me a little nervous because we did a lot of measuring with the Millennial Development Goals, and some of that measuring is very important, like clean water, housing. So I think we have to be very careful because we're becoming more aspirational at a time when development in some senses is under threat. And the actual material conditions of people on the ground, particularly in some regions, is actually deteriorating. So I think that's point number one, whereas development is shifting, but in some senses, if you're poor and you live in a shanty town, you know, it's not changed at all. You're still sort of in the same situation, wanting the same kind of things. I think we have to keep track of that. I started working in development when I was a 22-year-old graduate student at Clark University, and I was in Kenya working for the Ministry of Energy, working on a rural energy project. And it was very interesting because I was reading about development. So I was actually working with a ministry. And so I had a sense of looking at theory and practice, and it was really, really interesting to me. And the first thing I noticed is that this was a very large project. There was a combination of USAID money and Swedish CEDA money. But the money, a lot of it didn't go to Kenya. A lot of the money went to bank accounts of, you know, foresters and development people. And I was a grad student. I was getting a little bit of money. The money went right to my bank account in Massachusetts. That's the first thing I noticed, is that this big development project, and a lot of the money never even made it to Kenya. And so that kind of caught my attention. But it was really helpful because I really began to realize this notion of don't listen to what people say, look what they do, and really look on the ground. And I began to really understand that, you know, there were people who said I need a fence for my goats, and it would have cost $500, but we couldn't find money for a fence. But if you want to have a $2 million proposal to do some big project, that was easier to get. So I started realizing something was terribly wrong here, that development was an industry, and it wasn't necessarily to help people. It was really linked to the industrial sector. I mean, I can give you examples of that in terms of solar energy, where, you know, it was a solar project that was really linked to German GTI because it was a German industry that wanted to sell solar material, and it wasn't really about the needs of the people for cooking, and it wasn't a stove that they really needed. It was really more about industrial products. So it was really a good experience for me to, as a young person, to be on the ground, to be in the field, to be talking to people, and then also be reading the development literature, because you can really see theory and practice and look at some of the contradictions. My early experiences of being in the field, I would think I was just fortunate because I was put into a development project at a very young age, and I was transitioning from a master's to a PhD. But I think being in the field is important for anybody. I think once we lose contact with communities, we have the potential to lose contact with what we're actually doing. So I think it's very important for people who practice development and who evaluate development to be in the field. So for example, there's a lot of talk about big data. And it kind of reminds me, you know, I'm a geographer, I'm a professor of geography, and I remember when GIS, Geographic Information Systems, came to Africa. And I was working in Zimbabwe, I was working in South Africa. And you go to these agencies and there's these beautiful maps on the wall. because GIS produced beautiful maps, and everybody wanted beautiful maps, but the data was terrible. So we had inaccurate maps on the wall, but so-called big data at the time produced a nice product, so everybody wanted it. That's when I went out in the field and started talking to people around local knowledge in GIS. We began to do something called participatory GIS, because the local people, they know the area, and the so-called expert knowledge was not accurate. So that's one example. So one of my concerns about big data now is that I'll never stop believing that the best way to evaluate development is go talk to some people in the community. You know, when I go to communities and I talk to elders, for example, and obviously you're getting their perspective, because everybody has their perspective. You learn so much. So I'm a strong believer in combining qualitative and quantitative information. I know it's expensive. I know you can't do it everywhere. But if we start to really move more towards big data and spend less time just talking to people, I think the quality of the work will deteriorate. One of my early experience with Truth to Power, it still rattles me. I was a graduate student working in Zimbabwe, and my roommate was actually in military intelligence. And the only reason that happened is because his girlfriend was a friend of mine who was on the project. So just a strange coincidence that I lived in a house in Harare with a guy who was in military intelligence and part of Mugabe's inner circle. And he came back at 1 o'clock in the morning once. He'd been out for a couple of days, and he took his AK-47 and he put it on the table. He took his pistol, he put it on the table. His hands were shaking. And this is a very tough guy from Old Hatfield Township in Zimbabwe. I'm like, what's going on? He goes, you don't want to know. So I poured a little whiskey, we started talking. He was part of the first wave of people killing Mbele. And I'm sitting there and I'm a student. And I'm like, wow, this is different. So I actually, that next day, I went to the people who were running the project. And I told them what happened. And they told me, they said, shh, be quiet. I'm like, what do you mean be quiet? He goes, we don't want to lose the project. Okay? Now, I'm trained on the left. I'm part of the whole radical geography field. And I'm thinking, now, wait a minute. What's so radical about that? So that was the first time that I realized the contradictions of what we're doing and some of the immoral aspects of what we're doing. And it's a pretty extreme example, but it happened to me. Another example was when I was before that in Kenya. You know, I'd been in Kenya for a couple of weeks. I was all excited. I'm doing development. I'm a young kid. And somebody gives me an envelope that says, go up to the 7th floor and give it to the secretary. It was bribe money to the minister. So this is what I mean by theory and practice. I'm giving you bad examples. I'm giving you terrible examples. But as a student, they were quite transformative. And I could sit here for 3 hours and give you, wonderful examples of interacting with communities. I don't want you to think that that's my perception of what's going on. But, some of the contradictions of development. Now I believe these, in my heart, and I hate to say this because a lot of people who are a lot smarter than me don't agree with me, but I think the Sustainable Development Goals are the way for the powerful to not tell the truth. I mean, we live in a world where inequality is exploding, where poverty is not an issue for developing countries. I mean, the United States poverty is so high. We've got 1/4 of the world's prison population. So we live in a world where there are some issues. And the form of capitalism that is now going around the world is creating a lot of inequality, and a lot of wealth is siphoning to the top and not to the bottom. And this whole Sustainable Development Goals thing, I think it's a way for people to feel like they're helping people when they're really not. Which is like, for me, for evaluation, let's not keep our eyes off the ball. Yes, like so today there were some very good ideas about evaluating systems at the national level around Sustainable Development Goals. I think that's fantastic. That's exactly what we should be doing. But let's not take our eye off the ball, what we've been doing for all these years. How many people have clean water? How many people, who's eating? What's the nutritional status? And I like to see more human rights in our conversation. As human rights deteriorate, let's measure that too. So yes, we need to look at systems, and we need to look at the integration that the Sustainable Development Goals ask us to do, and we need to hold countries accountable for things. But let's continue to do what we've been doing, which is just to count and monitor basic things like food and water and shelter and land and access and freedom and being able to express yourself. That's pretty important. My career has been transformed by just talking to people. So I helped to start something called Participatory Geographic Information Systems, and that Participatory Geographic Information System is simply working with displaced families and elders in South Africa regarding the land that they had lost. And that's why, for me, you're never going to be able to replace an evaluation the power of local knowledge. I think nobody knows the situation better than local people. I understand the complexities of that in terms of social differentiated knowledge and people's positionality. But at the end of the day, people know where they live. They know what the situation is. Obviously, there's different perspectives out there. You know, qualitative information is messy. But it does scare me, this tendency to try to look at better data and better methods, because for me, it's the beauty and the power and the wonderful notion, the wonderfulness of people and the communities that I find to be so enriching and so valuable to us, which is why, coming full circle, never stop going in the field, never stop talking to people, never stop listening.